Hey Scott, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, I am great. It's wonderful to see your face, your smiling face, all the way over in Sacramento. I'm so glad we're sitting here today, Scott, in celebration of Wayne and his 100th birthday and the landmark exhibition that you are hosting at the Crocker in honor of it.
Well, the Crocker has a long relationship with Wayne. The first works that he showed at the Crocker, he showed in 1945. So literally 75 years ago.
Wow.
The Crocker did his first one-person show, which was called Influences on a Young Painter in 1951. And every decade since, the Crocker has done a show, a solo show of Wayne's work. When I asked him if he wanted to go down this path, he says, as you know, he says, I'm getting old and I have to think carefully about how to spend my time. But he ultimately decided that it was something he would like to do.
And he's always so generous with his time.
I have known about his work for a very long time, far before I ever knew him. And to just have this opportunity for me is just a great, great privilege.
When and how did you come into contact with him?
I think I met Wayne at an exhibition opening at Sacramento State. And there was a painting that he had on view of a deli counter. I wasn't really sure what I was going to say to him. So I said, I'm really curious about why the different dates on the bottom of the painting. And he said, I'm still learning. Then I remember another moment where in 2010, the Crocker opened its new wing. And in honor of that, Wayne presented us with a painting called River Intersection. And so it was wonderful. And he was telling me about this painting. And he was talking quite a long time. And I was fascinated because he's saying, well, I did this and I did this because of this. And he said, oh, I'm sorry, I must be boring you. And I said, no, I'm going to go home and write this in my diary because this is a big moment for an art historian. Yeah. I think if I were to tell people one thing about Wayne, if they don't know him, is that how beloved he is as a teacher, as a person. He's beloved for his humor, his humbleness. He's somebody that nobody ever has a bad thing to say about. And that is rare, especially when you get to a certain echelon in the world.
That's very beautifully said. I think what I think is so special about Wayne is how much he spans when he approaches art, whether it's subject matter, whether it's medium, whether it's scale, a small little gem or a large scale painting. He really is not afraid to do anything. And approach anything. And I love how he embraces that in his art. There aren't many artists out there like that, and he's been doing it for so long.
I think one of the things that Wayne does so well is to choose his medium wisely. So he often will pick watercolor if it makes sense to use watercolor, or pastel to draw pastels. He's also so good at what he calls object transference or simultaneity. And what that means is, how do you make pigment look like frosting or meringue, or sometimes a squiggle of ketchup or mustard, even scumbled streets.
And so when he's using oil, for example, and he gets those thick kind of peaks of impasto, and it's actually lending itself to look or feel like icing. I'm thinking specifically about pies.
He calls it combing. And he says you can't use acrylic to do that because it doesn't stand up in high ridges. I've equated it with kind of like the carefully manicured sands of a Zen garden, in that you have this very expressive way he applies paint that is so different than other artists.
So when you look at his pies, when you look at his cones, his big scoops of ice cream, you see triangles and circles. You see pyramids and spheres and geometry. Where do you think this comes from?
I think there was this moment where he was really struggling to find his voice. And one of the things that I know that he read was Earl Loren's book about Cezanne. And in it, Cezanne writes to Pierre Bonnard, once you know how to paint a cylinder, a sphere, a cube, or a cone, you'll know how to paint. And I feel like Wayne took that to heart. And he said he was, trying out triangles on circles. And suddenly he had a piece of pie, an ice cream cone, the painting 3 cones, for instance. It's literally spheres and cones. So it's a very formal thing that he was working on. And that's a little bit what sets his work apart in his mind from pop artists. He's never really liked the term pop art, in part because he saw his practice as being more formally focused and not necessarily so critical. But at the same time, he also said, I was making obvious connections to, our society and to the idea of consumerism and to mass production and things like that.
Yeah. How do you think he compares to the other pop artists of his generation? Because he came about in the early 1960s at the height of the pop art movement.
Yeah, what I also learned in the show is he was actually a little ahead of the pop art movement because his show happened in early 1962. And it wasn't until later in the year that Clement Greenberg, the great American art critic, sort of identified this sea change that had happened. And so he was a little bit ahead of it even. His approach was always different. He never really liked the association with pop art.
Right.
But the commonplace subject matter, it's undeniable, was part of that moment. His work is so much more personal. It's undeniably handmade. And then the other thing that really sets Thiebaud's work apart is the three-dimensionality of what he's doing. But Thiebaud introduces shadows and dimensionality. He punctures the picture plane. Wayne's work is definitely not flat. In fact, it's very intentionally three-dimensional. I think art history for Wayne has been incredibly important. He started off early on when he was teaching at what is now Sacramento City College. They put him in charge of the art history classes, among other things, and he was learning art history literally one step ahead of his students. And that knowledge of art history informs pretty much everything he does. The painting 4 pinball machines, for instance, has literal references to art history. First of all, it's a very formal exercise in shape and color and cubes. But in the background of the pinball machines, instead of a screen like you might normally see, he's given a nod to other artists, Frank Stella, Jasper Johns, and Ellsworth Kelly.
What about, your journey in curating the exhibition? Did you learn anything new? Was there anything that you were given insight into for the first time?
I learned a lot that was new. I think one of the major things that I came away with was the influence of Surrealism on his work, which I had never really thought much about, and I don't think a lot has been written about that.
For one of the chapters in your exhibition catalog, isn't it? Is a nod to Surrealism.
It is a nod to René Magritte, his painting called The Treachery of Images. This is not a pie instead of This is not a pipe.
I love it.
Early on, Barnett Newman was one of the first people to make this association. I think it's his body of work in general, but specifically the still lifes. And there's this metaphysical quality to those where he manages to, by extracting all the extraneous detail, make them very, very iconic and imbue them with meaning that's really rich and really layered. His version of surreal is just the quality, the aspect of the sort of otherworldly quality that happens with a lot of his works. Not the automatist side and that kind of side of surrealism, but the more imbuing ordinary objects with great, great meaning.
Do you think his artwork is infused with a sense of nostalgia?
I think there's a very strong nostalgic element in there, and I think he wants it to be there. He even said there's a lot of yearning there. So a lot of what he's portraying were things he was seeing in the 1930s when he was growing up and trying to recapture. At the same time, by taking a nostalgic subject, putting it into an environment that is so barren and stark and isolated, he's undoing what could be too sweet, literally too sweet, and sort of giving it an edge. He says that air-conditioned atmosphere of our contemporary world is what I'm after. And so, yes, you have this maybe sweet piece of pie or sweet piece of cake or ice cream, but you put it in this isolated, stark environment, and it suddenly has a sadness to it, a melancholy that factors in as well. At the same time, it makes you happy. It kind of also makes you sad. It's like something that's been lost.
A whole rush of emotions.
Yeah.
There's something to be said about the way that Wayne can find joys in the very simple things of life. And I think in the 21st century, where we have all gotten totally consumed in our jobs and our careers and travel and just the chaos of life, that these little micro moments that Wayne gives us, where we can just stop and pause and reflect on something very simple and beautiful, there aren't many artists out there who can do that.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And given us a place to pause, I think is really important.